Hey, and welcome back, guys. This is session number 45 of our Hey, and welcome back, guys. This is session number 45 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. And in this session, we're going to continue in chapter 13 and look at some check. Hey, welcome back, guys. This is session number 45 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. Can't believe we're only 6 or 7 sessions away from being done. In this session, we're going to explore chapter number 13, continue in chapter number 13, and look at some apocalyptic material from Mark. This time, Jesus addresses what is known as the abomination of desolation. Now, what is that? Well, that's what we're here to take a look at in this session. So let's go ahead and dive right into the text, why don't we? It starts like this. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. That's verse number 14. Let's start with these words here, the abomination of desolation. I wanted to point this out. It starts with when you see, though. When you see here. Before, if you look back in verse number 7, he starts with when you hear of rumors of wars and hear of other things. But here he starts with when you see. Now he's turning to what you actually see. And what does he start with? The abomination of desolation. Now, this appears elsewhere in Daniel chapter 11, verse 31, where Daniel actually talks about the abomination that causes desolation. And that occurred in some historical context here for you. That occurred in 167 BC when a dude named Antiochus, actually a Syrian ruler, he actually entered the temple and desecrated an altar by sacrificing pigs on the altar and pouring pig's blood all over the altar. Now, Jewish people would not enter the temple after that. Why? Because pigs to them were unclean animals and vile animals. So he came in and intentionally sacrificed pigs on that altar so that Jews could not go back into the temple. And this is the abomination of desolation that Daniel actually refers to in the book of Daniel. Now, when Jesus uses it here, it actually references a couple of different events, right? The fall of Jerusalem, right? Fall of Jerusalem, which occurs a little bit later after Jesus' time. And Jesus said earlier in this text, you remember, he said that not one stone would have remained on the temple. And less than 40 years later, that actually happened in Jerusalem. The Romans, after conquering the city, actually entered the temple with their military flags and set them up as objects of worship. So here Jesus is referring to the fall of Jerusalem as the abomination of desolation. But then there's also kind of a future pointing one. Future, right? There's going to be a period of great distress in the future that will be worse than anything before it, as we'll see. Now, look at what Jesus references as the abomination of desolation here. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be. He. Now, it's weird because he uses this masculine pronoun to describe what looks like a thing, right? Which means there's a person associated with this abomination of desolation. And this is a reference to, and you probably have heard this in movies, Left Behind and other things, refers to the Antichrist, right? This is a person who's going to be empowered by Satan to serve as an enemy of Jesus and the church. Now, whether it's one person or a spirit behind the people opposing the church is debatable among scholars. But later in our text, we'll hear Jesus talk about these false Christ that he talks about. Peter also later talks about this in 2 Thessalonians 2 through 3 and 4, where he says, "Let no one deceive you in any way, for in that day, unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he can take his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God." So even here in 2 Thessalonians, Paul talks about the Antichrist, right? That whole book is actually apocalyptic in that way. Look at this part. It says, "Let the reader understand." I love when Mark add these little notes, right? He's like, hey, you guys need to understand this, because it's kind of tough to understand unless you understand the cultural context behind what he is saying in this text. And what is he saying? Well, the passage goes on to say, "Let the one who is on the rooftop not go down, nor enter his house to take anything out, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak." A couple of different points of emphasis here. He's on the rooftop. He's talking about the person on the rooftop, and then the person in the field. Now, the roofs in Palestine, and to this day, they are pretty flat. And they had this outside staircase that you can come up and actually hang out on the flat roof, right? Especially when it was warm summer nights. It was like their loft area, right? That's why when you look in the Old Testament, David was able to see Bathsheba from his rooftop because she was bathing. He was on his rooftop taking in that view of Bathsheba in the tub. I guess that's a bathtub. I just made that up because they probably didn't have tubs, but she was bathing. Okay. What's so important about the cloak here? Some more cultural context. The cloak was an outer garment used as a coat during the day, and it had another purpose at night. It actually was used as a blanket. So it was used to keep people warm, right? That's why Paul asked Timothy to bring him his cloak in 2 Timothy at the end of that book. The brother was cold and he was trying to get warm. He said, "Hey, bring me my cloak." So what is this text saying? It's saying, hey, you need to leave hastily. Like, don't go down into your house if you're on the rooftop. Don't turn back if you forgot your cloak. Like, it's like if you ever go out of your house and you forget something and you know you're going to be late, if you go back and get it, you say, forget it. That's what Jesus is getting at here. This period of time requires haste on the part of God's people. There's no time for you to delay. You can't even go back to get your cloak. You can't even go back into your house because this period of time is going to require that haste. The passage goes on and says, "And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that it may not happen in the winter." Yes, the winter time is a bad time for women to be on their feet. Women to be hurt in their feet, period, who are pregnant and those who are nursing infants. So he is just stating something that is pretty obvious, but that's a time where you definitely don't want to be walking around pregnant during the winter time. "For in those days, there will be such a tribulation as has not been seen from the beginning of the creation that God created until now and never will be." Now, up until this time, Jesus had told the disciples to be steadfast when he talked about political revolutions, earthquakes, and other things. But this tribulation is going to require that they not remain steadfast, but they make haste. They run. This is much worse than all those other natural things that Jesus had mentioned. He says that this tribulation was going to be like any other thing that happens to the body of Christ. "And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he shortened the days." Now, what does this mean? Well, let's look at a couple of statements here. For the sake of the elect, and he shortened the days. So in this verse and all this tribulation, all these earthquakes and stuff, we find what I think is a beacon of God's grace and God's mercy in this period of tribulation. Why? Well, for the sake of the elect. those who were chosen in him before the foundation of the world to become sons and daughters through Christ's sacrifice. God himself decided to shorten, or is going to decide to shorten, the days of the tribulation. You see the mercy and the grace at present there, even when there's a tribulation period, that God is looking upon his people who are the righteousness of God in Christ Jesus, the elect, and he shortens those days for their sake. And then if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christ, remember we talked about that, and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. Mark points out the rise of false Christ and false prophets here, right? And let's do some Greek here right quick. Pseudo Christoi. Pseudo Christoi. Woo! Pseudo Christoi. And as you can see, pseudo means false or fake, and Christoi means Christ. So you have pseudonyms, that we have in our English language. Well, this talks about false Christ. False people who are going to perform signs and wonders to deceive people and legitimize their own claims to be messianic figures. Now, Jesus had mentioned false messiahs before in verse 5 and 6. What's the difference in this verse? Well, in 5 and 6, he warned against being deceived into thinking that Christ had returned. In these verses, the warning is against delaying one's escape because someone claims to be the Messiah who can protect them against danger, right? So that's the big difference here in this particular text. And then the text goes on to say, but be on guard. Have I told you all things beforehand? Jesus here says, be on guard. There's our word again, that blepto word. Watch out. I'm telling you what's going to happen. I want to turn back to something because these apocalyptic texts can get depressing sometimes, and we know that. And it's simply what Jesus says in verse number 20. We talked about this. God shortens the days of the tribulation for the elect. I want us to remember that. He extends this special measure of his grace in this period where terrible things are going to happen for his adopted sons and daughters. So our election here is pretty important, but it's not important because of anything that we've done. In fact, our election isn't secure because we're on the ballot, but because we're in the Lamb's book of life. Let me say that again. Our election isn't secure because we're on a ballot, but because we're in the Lamb's book of life. Jesus secured our election so that this text shouldn't make us fearful, but actually faithful. Faithful to be Christ's witnesses in a world that actually hates him. So that's our takeaway from this session. Do you know that you are elected? And God protects those that he elects. Will trials come? Yeah. Will tribulations occur? Of course. But this temporal situation can never impact our eternal destiny. So let's rejoice today that we're written in the Lamb's book of life, and that according to verse 20, that God himself shortens the days for those who are elected. All right, folks, that's been session number 45 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. We're going to dive into session number 46 next go round. Can't wait. Looking forward to it. See you guys then. Grace and peace to you all.